and welcome to the Civil Service World podcast. We're back at the Connected Places Summit, taking place in sunny central London, an event which brings together central government, local government, industry, academia, SMEs to think about how we drive innovation through the transport and construction sectors. It's hosted by the Connected Places Catapult, which is a government-backed innovation accelerator. And the Catapult includes the Innovation Procurement Empowerment Centre, recognising that a key way government can support innovation is by thinking carefully about how it spends its own money. It's a topic which even politicians agree is important. Chancellor Rachel Reeves this week said she wants government procurement to become a launchpad for scale-ups, not a check for global incumbents. It's a sentiment that I think almost everyone at this event would agree with, and particularly Rikesh Shah, who joins me now. He is chair of the Innovation Procurement Empowerment Centre. And we're going to have a conversation about what it looks like for government to use procurement as a strategic lever for innovation and why it's not just for procurement teams to think about that. Rikesh, welcome to the Civil Service World podcast. I want to start by going back to that quote from the Chancellor. She wants public procurement to become a launchpad for scale-ups. And you've spent your career trying to make just that happen. With the Chancellor making that public announcement, is it a turning point, do you think, or have we actually been here before?
I think it's really encouraging to hear the Chancellor say this. And the time is just right because the level of challenges we have in the public sector is significant. Despite us spending nearly 430 billion a year on public procurement, which is around 15% of GDP, frankly, we can see the money's not enough. We're having challenges around social care, child services, crime, transport, housing, education, the list goes on. We have to find new ways of delivery. With the Chancellor saying that we need to really use this as a launchpad for scale-ups, I totally agree. I think, firstly, we need to accelerate the adoption of new technologies. We're seeing advances in AI, advances in quantum, and many other new technologies. We've got to leverage that. The second area is we have to get more productivity from the public sector. And the way we do that is by bringing some of these innovative technologies in from the market to really create value. Thirdly, we're seeing geopolitical challenges across the world. It means we need to create these high growth potential companies in the UK that give us that security, not just productivity. Finally, sustainability is a massive challenge. How do we work with the ecosystem that we're creating, the scale-ups that we're creating, to create a sustainable green response to some of the policy goals that we have?
So you mentioned there the launchpad of the overall public sector procurement spend, which is kind of a well-rehearsed, massive number, but actually we're seeing it's not enough. There's another launchpad this month. We've had the announcement of the NISTA, the National Infrastructure and Transformation Authority's infrastructure pipeline. So the most recent update to that pipeline is £718 billion of investment over 10 years. It's public and private investment. And there's a huge scope to use that to drive innovation. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that would look like and some practical advice for civil servants. But first, can we explore what is innovation? So when I ask people, tell me about innovative projects, we want to showcase them. And I mostly get told about AI. So what for you is innovation?
I think there's two myths that we have to tackle here. I think the first one is innovation isn't just technical. And I think the second one is innovation isn't invention. It could be, but innovation could also be copying someone else from another category and deploying it in your industry. And I think that's a challenge that I faced throughout my career. I feel innovation is a philosophy, it's a mindset. It's about bringing new things in, new ideas. It could be a product, it could be a process, it could be something else. But it's how do you bring that new way of whatever it is into your way of working in the organization and realizing more value. And I think that is critical. Some of it could be continuous improvement. Some of it could be transformative change. And again, I think we need organizations, whether it's at a political level or an administrative level, to really be continuously improving.
You don't often hear procurement and philosophy and mindset in the same conversation. Two steps I want to take in this is when we think about procurement to bring in that philosophy of innovation. The first is how you structure a procurement to find innovation, and then picking up on that Chancellor's point around how you use it as a launchpad to scale. So how do we make sure that we are finding something innovative and we are actually growing it and not just putting it on the edges? So let's start with the first point. If you think of a traditional procurement structure, procurement process, why is that not finding innovation? And how do you think it needs to change to find innovation?
I'll give you some practical examples. From my time at Transport for London, we're probably spending 60 to 70% of our budgets on the supply chain. And that's quite similar in most organizations. What I learned within that organization was we need to get much better at shaping our pipeline, like well in advance, a year or two, maybe 3 years before the actual procurement's due. And by doing that, what you're doing is really understanding what's in the marketplace and seeing what innovative ideas there might be, which you can then put into your specification. And so as a result, that market engagement is important, but then you need to scout in the right way. If I'm only talking to the same old companies who are the tier one suppliers, I'll probably get the same old answers. So how do I diversify the engagement with different types of suppliers? So there could be scale-ups, there could be startups, there could be others. Linked to that, we've got to send early market signals. Where is it that you want people to innovate and why? And are you going to be a willing customer downstream? So again, there's a supply side piece. And then I think you start moving into the experimentation and really assessing what is this thing? How do you use it? Not just technically does it work? Can you deploy it in your city, in your organization? And what does value look like? Is there a business case? And then you start the procurement. So actually the procurement process is starting well ahead. And you're not only having procurement people doing this, it's got to be the whole system. It's got to be your IT director, your HR director, it could be the service owner, all these different people that are interested in the problem that you're trying to solve. And are they willing to solve it in a new way? And if so, move forward. If they're not, there's a cultural barrier that you need to address internally.
So I think, you're speaking about something there which starts well beyond the point at which most people would think we bring in procurement. So there's a kind of traditional process I would know from my speaking to people of we design our policy and we think about here's what we're going to buy to fix that. And then we go to procurement with a set of requirements to buy the thing we think we want to buy. And you're talking more about actually earlier than that, going to market and saying, here are the problems we have. And understanding how might you as a market solve those problems. And then thinking about let's experiment, explore the solutions and think at the very end about how we bring those in.
Absolutely. And the term I would use, and we produce a publication on this, is the art of the possible. We need to be much more entrepreneurial and say, what is the art of the possible with this particular problem that we're trying to solve? And I think we need to move away quite often of treating something that's outcome-based and innovative like a commodity. I think if you're buying tables and chairs, that's absolutely fine, right? Focusing on price and doing that as a renewal. But if you're trying to sort of achieve an outcome around creating safer roads on the network, more affordable housing, a response to energy and warmer homes in cities, well, there are problems that we're genuinely stuck on. So to do that, we need to really work within our system internally, say, what's the art of the possible? And are we willing to do it in a different way? And if we are, then let's work with the market and see what's available.
So there's two things I want to dive into there. One is working with the market. And I know when I speak to our readers and people that I interview, civil servants can be quite nervous about engaging with the market, particularly when the word procurement is involved. They don't want to step over any lines. They don't want to break any rules. So what's your practical advice on actually how do you engage well with the market?
And this is where I think procurement colleagues have an opportunity, but also sometimes they're also potentially a barrier. And I think this is where the procurement team needs to get much better at working with the service owners and shaping this pipeline. And I would advise to say, you're always learning. So as a result, whether it's desktop research or whether it's engaging with the market, see what's out there well in advance and also what's changing in the industry with the thing that you're buying. So I think that's point one, because sometimes when we start procuring, by the time we run the process and you go live, you're already out of date. So how do you ensure that on day one, it's fit for purpose and as innovative as it could be? The second point is then you've got a lifetime of a contract, which could be 10 years, 15 years. What you don't want is to procure something on day one, and then it doesn't incentivize the supplier to innovate during the lifetime of the contract. So as a result, by you doing that early engagement, you know where the technology is going. And as a result, you can define specifications that are much more attractive for more innovation to come in. But then you need to incentivize the supply chain to work with you on that. So I think definitely it's a challenge for procurement colleagues, but I think it's beyond that, particularly the service owners, because ultimately they're the ones that are using the new solution. And if they don't like it and they find a reason not to like it, they won't use it.
I want to pick up on that question of this isn't just procurement's role. What do other teams in the civil service need to do to use procurement differently? But because you mentioned there the whole life of a contract, I think that links us back nicely to that big opportunity with the NISTA pipeline. These are huge projects with a long life of contract and long program timeline. What would it look like for you to drive innovation right the way through those contracts? And I guess a sub-question of that is how do you set things up in a way to succeed at that scale rather than just, we've used the term innovation theatre in the past, just pilots or widgets?
I think NISTA, as you mentioned earlier, is a significant opportunity. They've set out a pipeline of 718 billion over 10 years, many projects. Not only supports us better outcomes through infrastructure delivery, but it creates new jobs, economic growth, and many other benefits. And I think going back to your point on how innovation procurement could be deployed here, I think the first step is we've got to do structured market engagement. So let's not assume we know who's the best players out there. Let's start with what outcomes we want and work back from there and do that structured market engagement and design categories of procurement within it. I think the second area is we've got to do more outcome-based specifications aligned with the missions. At the moment, I still think that the specifications are very input-based. I think we put the challenge now on the market and say, how would you deliver this and how would you price it? Because otherwise what happens is if we've got the answers to what we think the solutions are, what we will do is over-specify and then we'll put a price against it. I think let the market come up with some of the innovative ideas and let's incentivize them. Thirdly, we need to start thinking about how do we use different routes to market. With the new Procurement Act, whether it's a competitive flexible procedure or other procurement routes, let's use them effectively and maximize value. And then I think the other area is we need to sort of focus on training and capability building, not just within the procurement team, but it's also the wider service owners. And I think by putting some of that together, you get the right demand side. And hopefully you will then get the right pull from the supply side to respond to some of this innovation. And I think my final point is we've really got to think about scaling pathways. So we can't just do R&D at one end of the spectrum and then not take it forward. I think we need to focus on how do we ensure that we're doing the right experimentation and the piloting and building the evidence. How do we then move to the right procurement processes? But just as importantly, when you bring that in, how do you make sure that you're deploying in the right way at scale? And then how do you measure along the way to make sure you're adding value? And if it's not working, fail fast, move on to the next thing. So I think we need a new operating model as to how we use innovation procurement in the public sector.
You mentioned there, fail fast. It's often used in the context of innovation. And it is also something that is quite tricky culturally for civil servants to accept. Come on to that question about culture. You are someone who champions innovation and how to use procurement as a strategic lever for innovation. But many people who are listening or are among our audience might actually think, that is very risky. Innovation is risk for them. What argument would you make to them, people who think, I'm not ready, my project isn't ready for the level of risk that it would involve to take a more innovation-focused approach to the procurement process?
I'll give you a couple of practical examples first. So when I was in London, we released our open data. We released our data out there. And we were thinking we want to own what information the customers get. And we suddenly put the data out there. And that was a big change. Suddenly from us controlling the narrative on customer information to put it out there and you're using Google Maps, Citymapper, Apple Maps and many other products. But what we found was you got more innovation. And because the information was designed through the channel of choice the customer wants to use, it meant they used public transport more. So that was a really good example of how we were really risk averse about the information we have. We want to control the relationship and suddenly you let other people manage that. And the benefit we saw to London was every pound we invested, we got 130 back. Very clear business case. And now we've seen it across the world as to how people are using open data, not just for transparency, but for also other outcomes. That started with a process of what happens if this goes wrong? What happens if someone uses the wrong way and suddenly says we're not running our service in the right way? You put those safeguards in place to say, make sure, how do I mitigate any risk? And then the other area is we were focusing on roadworks. We're in London now. And how do we reduce the adverse impact of roadworks in the city, costing about 3 billion a year? We started to focus on congestion, air quality, and safety. We went out with a market. We used what was a previous procurement procedure called the Innovative Partnership Procedure, which allows you to really bring new innovation in, but it allows you to do R&D, scaling, and deployment through one procedure. What we found was we found new solutions that we hadn't heard of. We worked with companies we hadn't heard of. We awarded multi-million-pound contracts to these companies who found innovative solutions that frankly just weren't in the marketplace. But again, we had to mitigate that risk by bringing 60, 70 people from across the organization during that process. But the value that's being created is every pound we're investing, we're getting £3 back. So I think there are a couple of examples.
That's great in terms of, those are examples of where you took a risk as an organization and it's really paid off. The other observation, as you say, we're here in London, the London transport infrastructure has just transformed in the last 5 years. I came here today on a line bike. That change in the market is happening. And what is your reflection on how people can prepare for that. Innovation is going to happen in your policy areas, in your markets. How, as a mindset, as a culture, can you prepare for that?
You're absolutely right. Mobility has changed cities across the world. And if I just go back to when I was a kid and just cycling as an example, I had my BMX bike and I was riding around my local area. But just think about the bikes that are available now. You may own a bike. If you don't own a bike, it might be a docked bike, it might be a dockless bike, it might be an e-scooter, it might be electric, might not be electric. So the level of disruption that's just happened in the last 5-6 years has been massive. And now we're also starting to talk about connected autonomous vehicles, demand responsive buses, drones. The disruption is happening. So the first point to any policymaker or any service owner is disruption is happening in the marketplace, whether you're in education, whether you're in housing, whether you're in transport or crime or any other area. So we need to be ready for that. And the way you get ready for that is not saying yes to everything, nor you say no to everything. What you do is you create a framework to say, what are the key things that I really care about? So in the case of transport, I care about safety. I care about air quality. I care about the impact on public transport and sustainability. I care about privacy, what data is taken when you're on the line bike. So there's lots of things that I care about. Then you go out to the market and say, right, we don't want you just to come in. We want you to experiment. And we want to see how can you better address some of the policy outcomes we have. And once that's done, if you're working and the business case is working, you can then find a way of scaling that particular idea through policy. But it's not just policy. And that's where we come back to procurement. I think you apply it the same way. If someone says, I've got a brilliant AI solution, if someone says, I've got a new way to do modular housing, or I've got a new way to build rolling stock, or signaling, digital signaling, I think you go out there, listen, engage, really understand what it means for your context, and then do some experimentation. And if you think there is a new way of delivering, bring it in, but do it in an iterative manner rather than this big waterfall-led approach, which is this is what I want over 10 years. And also, who do you place the risk on? Do you put it on the supplier? Do you take the risk? How do you make sure if it's innovation, that's equally being distributed?
We could go down so many of these conversations into a deeper dive, but I want to wrap up. We've said that it's not just procurement's job. If we want to achieve the Chancellor's vision of using procurement as a strategic launchpad, then it's not going to be just about those teams in the procurement and commercial functions. So I'm going to have a slightly quick fire. I'm going to ask you to give us, for each of the following functions, someone listening from one of those functions, what would you like them to do differently to support procurement as a tool for innovation? So let's start with policy. What can they do?
I think create a framework where it's acceptable to diversify a supply chain and you bring different types of innovative ideas. And I would love to see policymakers to say, we need to allocate X percent of our budgets for innovation procurement that's built on evidence, it's proven. And as a result, you start creating more of a venture-based approach to this.
Finance teams, what could they do?
Only 20% of our spend from public procurement is still going to SMEs, and it's flatlined for the last 5 years. I think the finance teams need to encourage budget owners to say, why aren't we diversifying our supply chain? What value can be created from our supply chain? Because I want to do more with less.
And what about, because we're talking about NISTA, big infrastructure, they're going to have program and project delivery. What about from that function? What would you like to see from them?
I want program managers to plan early, project managers to plan early, a year, 2, 3 years before you're starting to deliver. And as a result, you can really see what's available out there, test it, trial it, and then decide how it moves into your delivery mechanism.
So we said it's not just about digital and widgets, but the DDAT function, what can they do to support this?
Quite often, tech teams feel like they own the innovation and they want to build it themselves. I think they need to be much more open to market innovation. Similarly for engineering teams, because there's a culture that we got to control the whole end-to-end process. Open yourself up to the wider market and see what's available.
Okay, and you mentioned culture, so the final function I'm going to speak about is HR. What would you like to see from the HR teams in the civil service to support the right kind of culture?
I think we've sort of created structures that are based on 50, 100 years of civil service. With the advances in technology, we've got to find a way of how can we be more nimble by bringing new technologies in. And that means that the skills that you need will be different. The types of structures you have in the business will be different. But fundamentally, the operating model you have will also be different. I think HR and transformation teams need to drive this change. Otherwise, we won't realize the value that's available.
Thank you for that really comprehensive rundown of different ways that different parts of the civil service can help. But do you have any kind of final call to action for anyone in our audience, how they can get involved or support the agenda?
Yep, thank you. So within the Innovation Procurement Empowerment Centre, we're just planning our cohort programs for next year. So if you're a local, regional or a national government department, please let us know what your problems are. And we're trying to consolidate them with others. And as a result, following that, we'll run a challenge, working very closely with the Commercial Innovation Hub. So please let us have your challenges. Do reach out.
Great. And we will put details of how to get in touch, how to find IPEC in the episode notes. So thank you so much, Rikesh. As I say, there is so many more conversations that we could have and probably will have over the years, but I think that's a great starting point to think about how people in our audience can achieve this aim of using procurement as a strategic tool to really drive the innovative outcomes that we want to see.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us and thank you for listening. If you are not already, please subscribe to the Civil Service World podcast so you can hear more of these conversations straight into wherever you listen to your podcasts.